The engine of the silver SUV hummed softly as it pulled up to the curb, the tires crunching against the gravel outside the Harmony Food Bank. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the weight of my 70 years pressing into the leather upholstery. My daughter-in-law, Claire, gripped the steering wheel, her manicured nails tapping impatiently. She didn't look at me. She hadn't looked at me much since she'd married my son, David, 5 years ago. "All right, Margaret," she said. Her voice clipped, like she was checking off a task. "This is it. They'll have what you need here." She gestured vaguely toward the squat brick building with its faded sign and the line of people snaking out the door. Her tone carried that practiced politeness, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. I nodded, my lips pressed into a thin smile, and opened the door. The air outside was crisp, tinged with the faint smell of damp leaves and the promise of autumn. I stepped onto the sidewalk, my worn loafers scuffing softly against the pavement. Claire didn't wait for me to say goodbye. The SUV pulled away before I could turn around, its taillights disappearing around the corner. I stood there, alone, the shawl draped over my shoulders fluttering in the breeze. The food bank loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the overcast sky. I knew this place better than Claire could ever imagine. For years, I'd poured my heart and my savings into keeping its doors open. But she didn't know that. No one in my family did. The line outside moved slowly, a quiet procession of tired faces and heavy coats. I joined them, my presence unremarkable among the crowd. A young mother with a toddler clinging to her leg glanced at me, offering a weary smile. I returned it, my heart aching for her, for all of them. I'd seen so many like her over the years, people stretched thin by life, reaching for a lifeline. That's why I'd started giving to Harmony all those years ago, back when my husband, George, was still alive. It wasn't just money. It was my way of holding on to hope, of believing that small acts could ripple outward. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of cardboard boxes and canned goods. Volunteers bustled behind the counter, their faces familiar to me, though I'd always kept my donations anonymous. I recognized Sarah, the director, her graying braids swinging as she handed out bags of groceries. She didn't know me as Margaret Ellis, the widow who'd written checks that kept the lights on. To her, I was just another face in the line. That was how I wanted it. No fanfare, no recognition, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd made a difference. As I shuffled forward, my thoughts drifted to David, my boy, my only child. He'd been my pride, my anchor after George passed. But things had changed since Claire came into his life. She was polished, ambitious, the kind of woman who measured worth in square footage and designer labels. I didn't fit into her world, with my modest house and my simple ways. David had started pulling away, his visits growing shorter, his calls less frequent. And then, this morning, Claire had shown up at my door, her smile tight as she suggested I might need a little help and drove me here. The sting of it lingered, sharp and cold. Not because I was standing in this line. I'd never been too proud to stand with those who needed help. No, the pain came from knowing my own son thought I was a burden, someone to be dropped off and forgotten. I wondered when I'd become invisible to him. Was it when I stopped hosting lavish dinners after George's death? When I sold the big house to live closer to town? Or was it Claire, whispering in his ear, reshaping his view of me? The line inched forward, and I clutched my shawl tighter. A young volunteer, barely out of his teens, handed me a canvas bag. "Here you go, ma'am." he said, his voice kind but hurried. I thanked him softly, peering into the bagkin beans. A loaf of bread. A small packet of rice. Simple things, but heavy with meaning. I'd helped by these very items. Month after month. Year after year. And now, here I was, accepting them as if I were just another stranger. I stepped outside, the bag weighing down my arm. The sky had darkened, clouds gathering like a storm waiting to break. I thought about calling David, about telling him the truth that I wasn't destitute, that I'd chosen to live simply so I could give more. But the words felt stuck, tangled in years of silence. I'd never told him about the food bank, about the checks I wrote in memory of his father. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I'd let him drift too far. As I walked home, the bag swinging at my side, I passed the old oak tree where George and I used to sit, dreaming about the future. I could almost hear his voice, warm and steady, telling me to keep going, to keep giving. And I would. But first, I needed to find a way to reach my son, to remind him who I was, not just his mother, but a woman who'd spent her life building something meaningful, even if it was hidden in the shadows. The walk home was longer than I remembered. Or maybe my legs were just heavier with the weight of the day. The canvas bag from the food bank bumped against my hip with every step, a quiet reminder of the morning's indignity. The streets of our small town were familiar, lined with modest houses and fading storefronts. But they felt different today. I passed the bakery where George and I used to buy pastries on Sunday mornings, the hardware store where he'd linger over tools he didn't need. Each corner held a memory, and each memory held him. By the time I reached my front door, my breath was shallow, my chest tight. The house was small, a single-story cottage I'd bought after selling the family home. It was enough for Mekazi, unpretentious, with a garden I tended with care. But to Claire, it must have looked like failure, a step down from the life she thought David deserved. I set the bag on the kitchen counter and sank into a chair, my hands trembling slightly. Not from age, but from the ache of being misunderstood. I hadn't always been this quiet, this invisible. When George was alive, we were a team hosting barbecues, volunteering at church, building a life that felt full. After he passed, I'd thrown myself into giving, funneling our savings into causes that mattered. The food bank was my favorite, a place where I could see the impact of every dollar. I'd sit in my study, writing checks in the glow of a single lamp, imagining the families those dollars would feed. It was my way of keeping George's kindness alive, of keeping myself alive. But David didn't know. I'd never told him, not wanting to burden him with my choices. He was busy building his career, his life with Claire. I thought he'd understand someday, when he was older, when he saw the world through softer eyes. Instead, he'd grown distant, his calls replaced by texts, his visits replaced by excuses. And Claire, well, she'd made it clear I was an inconvenience, a relic from a life David had outgrown. The phone sat on the table, silent as always. I reached for it, then stopped. What would I say? Your wife thinks I'm a charity case, but I've been funding that charity for years. It sounded absurd, even to me. Instead, I stood and walked to the study, where a small wooden box held my records. Inside were years of receipts, thank you letters from Harmony, carefully filed away. I pulled one out, dated 3 years ago. Dear anonymous donor, your generosity has kept our shelves stocked for another month. We cannot thank you enough. My eyes stung as I read it. This was my truth, even if no one else knew it. That evening, I cooked a simple meal from the food bank: bag beans and rice. seasoned with herbs from my garden. As I ate, I thought about the people I'd seen in line today, their faces etched with quiet strength. I wasn't so different from them. Need wasn't always about money. Sometimes it was about connection, about being seen. I wondered if David missed me as much as I missed him. I wondered if he even knew how to miss me anymore. The next morning, I woke with a plan. I couldn't keep hiding my truth. Not from my son. I called Harmony and spoke to Sarah, asking if I could volunteer. She was thrilled. Her voice warmed through the phone. We could always use an extra pair of hands, she said. I didn't tell her about my donations. Not yet. But I wanted to be there, to feel the pulse of the place I'd helped build. Maybe, in time, I could show David what it meant to me. When I arrived at the food bank, the line was already forming. I slipped behind the counter, tying an apron over my sweater. Sarah handed me a stack of bags to fill, her smile kind but distracted. I worked quietly, packing cans and boxes, listening to the hum of conversation around me. There was a rhythm to it, a shared purpose that felt like home. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. As the day wore on, I thought about Claire's face when she dropped me off, her quick glance, her hurried departure. She hadn't meant to hurt me, I realized. She just didn't know me. And maybe that was my fault as much as hers. I'd let myself fade into the background, thinking it was noble to stay quiet. But silence hadn't brought me closer to my son. It had only built walls. By the time my shift ended, my back ached, but my heart felt lighter. I walked home under a sky streaked with pink, the air cool against my face. I knew what I had to do. I would invite David and Claire to dinner, not to confront them, but to share my world. I'd tell them about the food bank, about the years of giving, about the love that had driven it all. And maybe, just maybe, they'd see me again not as a burden, but as a woman who'd never stopped trying to make a difference. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and garlic as I prepared dinner. It was a simple meal: roasted chicken, potatoes, a salad from my garden, but it felt like a bridge, a way to bring David and Claire back to me. I'd spent the day cleaning the house, polishing the old oak table where George and I had shared so many meals. The invitation had been sent yesterday. A short text to David: dinner at my place this Sunday. I'd love to see you both. His reply had been brief: sure, Mom. We'll be there, but it was enough to spark hope. As I chopped vegetables, my mind wandered to the food bank. Volunteering there had become my anchor, a reminder that I still had purpose. Yesterday, I'd helped a young man named Javier, his hands calloused from construction work, his eyes downcast as he accepted a bag of groceries. Thank you, he'd whispered, and I'd felt a warmth that no check could ever buy. I wanted David to see that, to understand why I'd given so much to this place. But I wasn't sure how to start that conversation without sounding like I was pleading for their approval. The doorbell rang at 6 sharp, and my heart leapt. I smoothed my apron, took a deep breath, and opened the door. David stood there, taller than I remembered, his dark hair flecked with gray. Claire was beside him, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun, her smile polite but guarded. Hi, Mom, David said, leaning in for a quick hug. His arms felt stiff, like he was holding something back. Claire nodded, her eyes scanning the small living room. It's cozy, she said, and I couldn't tell if it was a compliment or a judgment. We sat at the table, the candlelight flickering against the walls. For a while, the conversation was light: David's job, Claire's latest project, the weather. But there was an undercurrent, a tension I couldn't ignore. Claire's fork paused midair as she spoke about their new house. Her words polished but distant. David glanced at me occasionally, his eyes searching, but he didn't ask about my life. Not yet. Finally, I took a breath and set down my glass. I've been volunteering at the Harmony Food Bank, I said, my voice steady but soft. David's eyebrows lifted, and Claire's fork stilled. It's been rewarding. I've been going there a few times a week, helping pack groceries, meeting people. It's important to me. David frowned slightly. The food bank. Mom, you don't need to do that. If you need help, we can. He stopped, his words hanging in the air. Claire's lips tightened, and I knew what they were thinking. The same thing she'd thought when she dropped me off there. I don't need help, I said, my voice firmer now. I've been giving to that food bank for years. Long before you thought I needed to go there. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, and David's face flushed. Claire set her napkin down, her eyes narrowing slightly. Giving? David asked, his voice low. What do you mean? I stood and walked to the study, my hands trembling as I pulled out the wooden box. I returned with a folder, the receipts and letters spilling out as I placed it on the table. This, I said, opening it to show them. I've been funding Harmony since your father died. Most of our savings went there. It's why I live here, in this house, instead of something bigger. It's why I don't have much, but I have enough. David stared at the papers, his jaw tight. Claire's face was unreadable, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. You never told me, David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Why didn't you say anything? I sat down, my hands clasped in my lap. I didn't want you to feel obligated. I wanted you to live your life, not mine. But I also wanted to do something that mattered, something your father would have been proud of. The food bank, it's not just about food. It's about people, about giving them hope. Claire shifted in her seat, her eyes flickering to the folder. That's generous, she said, but her tone was guarded, like she was weighing her words. David reached for a letter, scanning the words of gratitude from Sarah. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, he looked like the boy who used to climb into my lap, asking for stories. I thought, he started, then stopped. When Claire took you there, I thought you needed help. I didn't know. The room felt heavy, the air thick with unspoken things. I wanted to reach for him, to bridge the gap that had grown between us. But I stayed still, letting the truth settle. I don't need help, I said softly. I just need you to see me. Dinner ended quietly, the clink of dishes the only sound as we cleared the table. David hugged me before they left, his arms lingering a little longer this time. Claire's goodbye was polite, but there was something new in her eyes, a flicker of respect. Maybe, or curiosity. As their car pulled away, I stood in the doorway, the night air cool against my skin. I didn't know if this was a beginning or just a moment, but it felt like a step. A small one, but enough to keep me moving forward. The days after the dinner stretched long and quiet, the house settling into its familiar rhythm. I kept busy at the food bank, my hands moving through the motions of sorting cans and bagging groceries. But my mind lingered on David's face that night, the shock, the guilt, the flicker of something like pride. I hadn't heard from him since, and though I checked my phone more often than I cared to admit, I didn't push. Some bridges take time to build. At Harmony, the work was steady, grounding. I'd grown fond of the volunteers, their stories weaving into mine. There was Javier, who came back every week, not just for groceries, but to talk, his shy smile brightening when I remembered his name. There was Sarah, who ran the place with a fierce kindness, never asking for thanks. And then there was Lila, a teenager who volunteered after school, her energy a spark in the quiet hum of the food bank. She reminded me of David at that age, curious, a little reckless, full of questions about the world. One afternoon, as I stacked boxes of pasta, Lila sidled up to me. "Miss Margaret, why do you do this?" she asked, her voice blunt but not unkind. "You're not like the others. You don't need to be here." I paused, a box in my hands. "I need to be here as much as anyone," I said. "Maybe not for food, but for purpose. This place gives me that." She tilted her head, her ponytail swinging. "That's cool," she said, and I laughed, surprised by how much her words warmed me. I wondered if David would understand that, if he could see the food bank not as a place of lack, but as a place of connection. That evening, I sat in my garden, the last of the summer flowers drooping under the weight of autumn. I was pulling weeds when my phone buzzed. A text from David, "Can I come by tomorrow?" Just me. My heart stuttered, a mix of hope and nerves. I typed back a quick yes, my fingers clumsy on the keys. He arrived the next morning, his car pulling up just as I was watering the roses. He looked tired, his tie loosened, his eyes softer than they'd been at dinner. "Hey, Mom," he said, stepping onto the porch. "Can we talk?" We sat in the living room, sunlight filtering through the curtains. He held a mug of coffee I'd made, his hands wrapped around it like it was an anchor. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started, his voice low. "About the food bank. About Dad. I didn't know you were doing all that." I nodded, waiting. I'd learned long ago that silence could draw out truths words couldn't reach. "I feel like I let you down," he said, his eyes fixed on the mug. "I got so caught up in my life work. Claire. The house. I didn't see what you were doing. I didn't see you." His words hit like a wave, soft but heavy. I reached for his hand, my fingers brushing his. "You didn't let me down, David. You just forgot to look." He looked up then, his eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in years: regret. Maybe. Or love. "I want to understand," he said. "Will you show me? The food bank. I mean, I want to see what it means to you." I felt my throat tighten, but I nodded. "Tomorrow," I said. "Come with me tomorrow." The next day, we walked into Harmony together. The line was long, as always, and I saw David's eyes widen as he took it in the mothers, the elderly, the young men with tired faces. I introduced him to Sarah, who shook his hand warmly, unaware of the checks I'd written. I showed him the shelves, the bags we packed, the quiet rhythm of giving. He didn't say much, but he listened, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. When we stepped outside, he turned to me. "This is a lot," he said. "You've been doing this for years, and I had no idea. I'm sorry, Mom." I touched his arm, my voice soft. "Don't be sorry. Just be here now." As we walked back to his car, I felt something shift, like a door creaking open. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. David wasn't the boy who'd climbed into my lap anymore, but he was still my son. And maybe, in time, he'd see the world I'd been building, not just for others, but for us. David started coming to the food bank with me once a week. It was tentative at first, his hands awkward as he packed bags, his smiles hesitant. But he kept showing up, and I saw glimpses of the boy I'd raised, curious, kind, eager to help. He asked questions about the people we served, about the system that kept Harmony running. I answered what I could, careful not to reveal my role as a donor. That truth felt too big, too fragile, to share just yet. One afternoon, as we sorted cans, Sarah pulled me aside. "Your son's a natural," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "He's got your heart, Margaret." I nodded, my throat tight. I wanted to tell her everything about the checks, about the years of giving, but I held back. It wasn't about recognition. It was about being here, with David, rebuilding what we'd lost. Claire hadn't come with him, and I didn't ask why. I sensed she was still processing the dinner, the folder of receipts, the truth about my life. Part of me wanted to reach out to her, to explain, but I didn't know how. She was so different from Mess Harpaged, driven, her world built on ambition. I wondered if she'd ever understand the quiet joy of giving without expectation. That evening, David stayed for dinner at my house. We sat in the garden, the air cool, the stars just beginning to peek through. He talked about work, about the pressure to keep up with Claire's vision of success. "She means well," he said, his voice soft. "But sometimes I think she doesn't get it. The important stuff. You know." I nodded, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "The important stuff takes time to see," I said. "It's not always loud or shiny. It's in the small things, the way you show up, the way you care." He looked at me, his eyes searching. "Like you in the food bank." I smiled, my heart full. "Like that." The next week, something shifted. David arrived at Harmony with a box of donated canned goods from his office. "Thought it might help," he said, a little sheepish. I watched as he handed them to Sarah, her face lighting up with gratitude. For the first time, I saw him stand a little taller, like he was starting to feel the weight of what this place meant. Later, as we walked home, he asked, "How did you start giving to the food bank? I mean, why there?" I took a breath, the truth pressing against my lips. "After your father died, I needed something to hold on to," I said. "He always believed in helping people, in making things better. The food bank was my way of keeping him with me, and it grew from there." David nodded, his hands in his pockets. "I wish I'd known," he said. "I wish I'd asked." "You're asking now," I said, and that was enough. That night, I lay awake, thinking about Claire. I wondered if she'd ever see this side of David, the side that was waking up again. I wanted to believe she could, that she wasn't just the woman who dropped me at the food bank, but someone who might learn to value what I valued. I decided to invite her to Harmony, not to confront her, but to share this world with her. Maybe, in time, she'd understand. The next morning, I sent her a text. "Claire, I'd love for you to see the food bank. Maybe you could come with David next week." I didn't expect a reply, but it came within minutes. "I'll think about it." It wasn't much, but it was something. As I walked to Harmony that day, I felt a quiet hope. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it was there, winding through the choices I'd made and the ones I still had to make. I'd spent years giving in the shadows, but now, I was ready to step into the light, not for recognition, but for connection. For David. For Claire. For the family we could still be. Claire came to the food bank the following week. She arrived with David, her heels clicking on the pavement, her face a careful mask of politeness. I greeted her warmly, but her eyes darted around, taking in the worn walls, the crowded shelves, the line of people waiting. I wondered what she saw: a charity case, a relic, or something more. I hoped it was the latter. We worked side by side that morning, packing bags in silence at first. David was across the room, joking with Javier, his laughter a sound I hadn't heard in too long. Claire's hands moved quickly, efficiently, but I could sense her discomfort, like she was out of place in this world of cardboard boxes and quiet gratitude. I didn't push her to talk. I just kept working, letting her find her rhythm. Halfway through the shift, Sarah called me over to help with a delivery. When I returned, I saw Claire talking to Lila, the teenage volunteer. Lila was gesturing wildly, telling a story about a family they'd helped last week, her voice bright with passion. Claire listened, her head tilted, a small smile breaking through her reserve. It was the first time I'd seen her soften, and it gave me hope. At the end of the shift, Claire lingered by the door, her purse slung over her shoulder. "This place is different than I thought," she said, her voice low. "I didn't realize how much it does." I nodded, my hands clasped in front of me. "It's more than food," I said. "It's about giving people a chance to keep going." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in her eyes. Not understanding, not yet, but curiosity. "David told me you've been giving here for years," she said. "I didn't know." "I didn't tell anyone," I said. "It wasn't about that." She nodded, her lips pressing together. "I'm sorry," she said finally, the words soft but heavy. "For assuming. For dropping you off like that." I reached for her hand, my fingers brushing hers. "You didn't know," I said. "But you're here now. That's what matters." We walked out together, the three of us: David, Claire, and me. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were a family again. Not perfect, but trying. David put his arm around my shoulders, and Claire walked close, her steps less hurried than before. We didn't talk about the past, about the distance that had grown between us. We didn't need to. The food bank had done that for us, its quiet work weaving us back together. That night, I sat in my study, the wooden box open in front of me. I pulled out the latest letter from Sarah, thanking the anonymous donor for another year of support. I smiled, tracing the words with my finger. I didn't need to be anonymous anymore. Not to my family. Not to myself. The next week, David and Claire came back to Harmony. They brought more donations, their faces brighter, their hands more sure. We worked together, laughing, talking, building something new. And as I watched them, I thought of George, of the life we'd built, of the love we'd shared. It was still here, in the bags we packed, in the people we helped, in the family we were becoming again. The food bank had been my secret for so long, a quiet act of love in a world that often felt too loud. But now, it was something more: a bridge, a beginning, a way to show my son and his wife who I was, and who we could be together. And as I stood there, surrounded by the hum of giving, I knew I'd found my place, not just in the world, but in their hearts.